The lights were blinding, the cameras flashing like 1,000 restless eyes, when George Clooney leaned forward and let the words roll off his tongue. Smooth, confident. Cutting, he wasn't joking. He was dismissing. With a smile that carried more arrogance than charm, Clooney called Jasmine Crockett a lightweight trying to play in arenas far above her head. The audience gasped, some in shock, others in complicit laughter. Feeding off the glitz of a Hollywood icon wielding his stardom like a blade, for a moment it felt as if the room had tilted in his favor. He basked in the tension, accustomed to applause, certain that his words would settle the debate before it even began. Clooney, the beloved actor turned public commentator, had just reduced a sitting congresswoman to a punchline, and he did it with the ease of a man who had never been told no in a room full of cameras. But if you looked closely, you could see the arrogance tightening the edges of his grin. This wasn't Wititwa's entitlement, and it hung in the air. Heavy, almost suffocating. His insult wasn't just aimed at Crockett. It was aimed at every woman who had been told to stay quiet. Every black leader who had been dismissed as too loud. Every immigrant child told their voice didn't belong in America's story. Clooney had made the mistake of confusing spotlight with authority and then silence. Crockett did not flinch. She didn't rush to defend herself. She simply stared, her expression carved from composure, her silence louder than Clooney's insult. The cameras turned toward her, and in that stillness the power shifted. She didn't need the glitz, the stage, or the applause. She had something. He didn't. Truth, discipline, and receipts. The audience could feel it too. A ripple ran through the room, a subtle change in energy, as if everyone knew the moment wasn't finished, it was only loading. Clooney, still reveling in his own words, didn't notice that the stage he thought he owned was already slipping from beneath him, because what Jasmine Crockett said next would make George Clooney wish he had stayed silent. What happened in that moment wasn't just an insult tossed across a stage, it was a mirror held up to America's ongoing struggle with power, privilege, and who gets to speak without interruption. George Clooney, adored for decades as the suave face of Hollywood, carried the weight of celebrity influence into the conversation. His words weren't simply one man's opinion. They carried the echo of a culture that too often elevates fame above substance. In that smirk, in that dismissive tone, millions could hear the same tired chorus. Sit down, stay quiet, know your place. For women of color in public life. It is a refrain they've endured again and again. Clooney's jab wasn't. Knew it was ancient, recycled through centuries of boardrooms, newsrooms, and halls of power. But here it was, dressed up in a tuxedo of charm, packaged as wit, amplified by the cameras hungry for conflict. His arrogance wasn't just personal, it was cultural, it was systemic. And that is precisely why it stung so deeply. Jasmine Crockett, however, didn't stand on that stage as one woman alone. She carried with her generations of resilience, voices silenced, opportunities denied, names erased. She embodied the truth that representation isn't ornamental, it's essential. Every pause she held, every ounce of restraint in her silence, was a declaration she would not shrink to make others comfortable. Her presence was proof that dignity could outlast derision, and that truth, no matter how inconvenient, eventually demands the microphone. Clooney believed the spotlight gave him the upper hand. What he didn't anticipate was that Crockett had something far stronger than celebrity glow. She had receipts. Receipts of policy, of lived experience, of undeniable fact. She had the kind of evidence that no charm offensive could erase, no clever insult could outshine. Where Clooney came armed with applause lines, Crockett came armed with reality. And reality has a way of cutting sharper than any Hollywood one-liner. The stakes were no longer about two figures on a stage. They were about whether America still rewards style over substance, privilege over perseverance, ego over service. Millions watching saw themselves in Crockett's calm. The immigrant who had been told their accent disqualified them. The young activist dismissed as naive. The professional woman overlooked in meetings where men dominated the conversation. Crockett stood as the answer to them, all a living rebuttal to a culture that's underestimates women who fight back with grace and fire. The tension rose like a storm on the horizon. Clooney's laughter had already begun to falter, as if somewhere, deep down, he knew he had crossed into dangerous territory. The audience shifted in their seats. The cameras leaned in closer, instinctively sensing history taking shape. This was no longer about a celebrity quip. It was about the collision of two Americas, one clinging to the illusion of inherited authority, the other demanding space for truth. And then Crockett moved. Small shift, but enough to send a ripple through the room. She leaned forward, the kind of deliberate motion that told everyone she was done absorbing, done letting the arrogance echo unchecked. Her eyes locked on Clooney, not with anger, but with the kind of calm precision that signaled he was about to face something far more dangerous than applause lines. And that's when Crockett leaned forward, and the entire tone of the room shifted. For decades, George Clooney has been Hollywood's golden son. The square-jawed charmer who could turn a smirk into a headline, who moved seamlessly between blockbuster thrillers and socially conscious films. He wasn't just an actor. He was a brand, a symbol of sophistication, activism, and the easy confidence of a man born into both talent and access. He campaigned for human rights, raised millions for global causes, and stood beside politicians. As though the world itself were his stage too many, Clooney wasn't just a star, he was a conscience in a tuxedo. The man who could host a fundraiser on Saturday and deliver a monologue about justice on Sunday. He knew how to play the role of the Hollywood statesman, his voice smooth, his presence commanding. People believed him when he spoke of fairness, of decency, of democracy. And in the glow of his career, contradictions were often forgiven or ignored. But the man who had built his reputation on righteous commentary revealed another side when confronted by someone who didn't fit into his script. Against Jasmine Crockett, his polished mask slipped. In place of wisdom, he offered mockery. In place of solidarity, condescension. His insult was not merely a lapse of judgment, it was a window into the entitlement that had long simmered beneath. His charm, because Clooney, for all his causes, has always been insulated by privilege. He could drop in and out of movements without consequence, lend his voice without risking his livelihood, leave a stage and still be adored. When he championed justice abroad, it elevated his image. But when justice sat across from him in the form of a sharp, unapologetic Congresswoman, his reflex was not solidarity, was dismissal. The contradiction was glaring. He preached empowerment, but bristled when that empowerment didn't come dressed in Hollywood glamour. There were cracks. In the facade long before this night, interviews where Clooney's wit shaded into arrogance, where his confidence in speaking on any subject bled into presumption. Red carpet moments where jokes at others' expense revealed the edge beneath his charm. Even in his activism, critics noted how icily he positioned himself at the center. The celebrity savior, whose spotlight sometimes obscured the very people he claimed to uplift. On that stage, those cracks widened. His attempt to reduce Crockett wasn't an isolated moment of carelessness. It was the culmination of years of entitlement, years of being told his voice mattered more. His presence carried weight. His name alone was substance enough. And in that arrogance lay the seeds of his downfall. For while Clooney assumed his stardom, gave him the authority to cut others down, Crockett had come armed with something he could never manufacture: lived experience, preparation, and proof. It's almost poetic, the actor so skilled at controlling a scene, undone by a scene he couldn't script. Clooney's downfall wasn't in the insult itself, but in the miscalculation behind it. He underestimated who sat across from him. He saw only a congresswoman he could belittle, not the force she represented. And so he smiled, thinking the cameras would crown him the victor, blind to the reality that those same cameras were capturing the unraveling of his carefully crafted persona, because charisma can dazzle, cannot shield arrogance forever. The moment Clooney wielded his celebrity against Crockett, the very foundation of his image began to shake. Here was the contradiction laid bare: the man who stood for justice when it polished his halo, yet dismissed justice when it stared him in the eye. He basked in the laughter, mistaking it for triumph. He bathed in the applause, unaware it was the last time the crowd would cheer so freely for him. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was the quiet power building in the woman across from him. Power not fed by cameras or red carpets, but by truth, discipline, and the resilience of someone who had fought for every inch of ground she stood on. And while George Clooney basked in the spotlight, Jasmine Crockett had been preparing in silence. Long before she walked into the chamber where George Clooney would try to dismiss her, Jasmine Crockett had already faced battles far more brutal than a celebrity's insult. She was not born into privilege, nor did she glide into public life. On a red carpet, her story began in the heart of America, where hard work was not optional, but survival, where every step forward required not just effort, but grit. As a young girl, Crockett absorbed the lessons of resilience from her family and community. She saw how doors closed faster for those who looked like her, how rules bent for some, but remained ironclad for others. From those early years, she understood that dignity was not given, it had to be defended. When classmates doubted her, when society tried to shrink her ambitions, Crockett refused to retreat. Instead, she sharpened her mind, layering discipline over defiance, determination over doubt. Her path to Congress was anything but smooth. She studied hard, pushing into spaces where people like her were rarely welcomed, and she learned quickly that brilliance alone was never enough. She endured the subtle dismissals, the outright mockery, the whispered warnings that she was too ambitious, too loud, too unapologetic. Each slight became fuel, each barrier a reason to push harder. But Crockett treated it like a battlefield. Every case she studied was another weapon in her arsenal. Every challenge, another chance to prepare for the bigger fight ahead. As an attorney, she found her calling in defending the voiceless clients who had been crushed by a system designed to ignore them. She stood in courtrooms where justice tilted, against the poor, the immigrant, the marginalized, and she fought anyway. Sometimes she won, sometimes she lost. But always she walked away with more fire in her chest, more clarity about the inequities that scarred America. She didn't practice law for prestige or applause. She did it because she knew what it felt like to be dismissed, and she refused to let others face that battle alone. Those years in the trenches forged her reputation. Crockett became known not only for her legal sharpness, but for her calm in the storm. Judges, opposing counsel, and even her critics noted the same thing. When others raised their voices in desperation, Crockett never cracked. Her sharp wit cut through noise like a scalpel. Her poise disarmed opponents who expected her to fold. That unshakable calm would later become her weapon in Congress, a quiet strength that shook louder than any outburst. When she eventually ran for office, it wasn't glamour that carried her campaign, it was grit. She didn't have Hollywood donors showering her with checks or media conglomerates writing puff pieces. She knocked on doors, shook hands, listened to concerns, and promised to bring the voices of the overlooked into the halls of power. Her victory was not just personal, it was communal. Every person who had been silenced felt a piece of themselves enter the chamber with her. In Congress, Crockett quickly made a name for herself. She wasn't afraid to confront hypocrisy, wasn't hesitant to stand alone if principle demanded. Critics tried to label her as brash, but her supporters saw the truth. She was sharp, deliberate, and unafraid. When hearings devolved into political theater, she stayed focused. When arrogance tried to steamroll the truth, she sat taller. Her words landed not because she shouted, but because she spoke with the precision of someone who knew the weight of every syllable, and through it all, Crockett never forgot where she came from. She carried her community with her, reminding colleagues and constituents alike that her success was built on sacrifice, not just her own, but that of every teacher, parent, and neighbor who believed in her when the world didn't. She remained grounded, never mistaking position for purpose. She knew power was not about ego, it was about service. That is what made her so dangerous to figures like George Clooney. While Clooney's authority came from spotlight and status, Crockett's came from lived truth. He could memorize lines. For a role, she had lived the lines of struggle, resilience, and triumph. He relied on charm. She relied on character. He wielded fame, who wielded facts. So when Clooney unleashed his insult, he wasn't just sparring with another politician. He was colliding with the sum of Crockett's life, the sacrifices, the scars, the unshakable resolve that had carried her from obscurity to Congress. In her silence after his words, all of that history shimmered just beneath the surface. She didn't need to rise instantly or lash out. She knew she had endured worse, and she knew that when she finally responded, her words would land with the weight of everything she had lived through. And it was this lifetime of preparation that exploded in one single moment against George Clooney. Air thickened as Clooney leaned back in his chair, flashing that same rehearsed grin that had charmed audiences for decades. His first jab had drawn gasps, but now he doubled down, repeating the dismissal as if saying it again would make it true. "Congress needs leaders, not rookies," he quipped, his tone laced with mock sympathy, as if Crockett's very presence was a mistake he was benevolent enough to correct. Laughter trickled from a few corners of the room, brittle and nervous. But Clooney treated it like a standing ovation. Jasmine Crockett didn't bite. Her face remained unreadable, her silence stretching longer than Clooney anticipated. That pause was power. It was the kind of silence that unsettled, the kind that forced every person watching to fill in the blank themselves. A tone as precise as a scalpel, she answered not with outrage, not with theatrics, but with facts. Calm, deliberate, steady. Clooney smirked again, leaning forward, launching another insult dressed as wisdom. He told her she lacked real-world experience, that she was all passion, no substance. He let the words linger, expecting them to land like daggers. Instead, they evaporated in the space between them, drowned out by the sharpness of Crockett's restraint. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She let his arrogance echo off the walls before slicing through with a rebuttal that was cooler, sharper, undeniable. It was no longer a conversation, it was a duel. Clooney wielded his Hollywood glamour like a sword, relying on charm, cadence, and reputation. But Crockett countered with something heavier, hard-earned grit, the kind forged in courtrooms and community halls, not film sets. She jabbed, and she absorbed. He swung, and she deflected. Each insult was followed by a silence so pointed that when she finally spoke, her words cut deeper. The rhythm became unmistakable. Insult, silence, rebuttal. Clooney's digs came faster, his smile stretching thinner each time, as though he was trying to smother his own unease with performance. Crockett's replies, by contrast, landed like stone tablets, firm, measured, impossible to dismiss. She didn't need the crowd to cheer her on. Her authority didn't come from applause. It came from the undeniability of someone who had fought. For every inch of her legitimacy, Clooney's confidence began to fray. He leaned harder into his star power, raising his voice, gesturing broadly, searching for the kind of adoration he was used to commanding. But the room wasn't buying it anymore. The laughter faded, the applause stalled. Slowly, the audience leaned toward Crockett, pulled in by the gravity of her composure. Clooney was performing, Crockett was living. Difference. Every time he tried to belittle her, she parried not with anger, but with precision. She cited facts, invoked history, and framed her presence as unshakable. Each rebuttal drew the stage closer to her, stripping Clooney's performance of its luster. The very spotlight he had counted on now illuminated his unraveling. By the fifth exchange, the duel was no longer even. Clooney's voice grew sharper, almost desperate, while Crockett's sharpened too, but in a different way. Her tone no longer simply parried his insults. It pressed back. Her calmness transformed into a quiet authority that filled the room, exposing Clooney's bravado as shallow. The duel had turned, and everyone watching could sense it. And then came the counterstrike. No one was ready for it, began quietly. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, no sharp retort to match Clooney's showmanship. Jasmine Crockett simply folded her hands on the table before her, her voice measured and calm, carrying just enough weight to make every syllable land like a hammer. The room, already unsettled, leaned closer as though drawn by gravity. Mr. Clooney, she began, her tone stripped of hostility, but layered with precision. You said Congress doesn't need rookies? Let's talk about what Congress really doesn't need. The words hung, deliberate, and unhurried. Then she began laying down facts, one by one, each one like a card dropped on the table. Congress doesn't need millionaires and billionaires, swooping in only when it benefits their brand. Congress doesn't need people who sit in mansions talking about justice, but can't stomach a woman who actually fights for it in courtrooms, neighborhoods, and communities most of you have never even walked through. A murmur rippled through the audience. Clooney's smile stiffened. He shifted in his chair, suddenly less comfortable under the lights that had always been his ally. Crockett continued, her voice gaining momentum. Not by growing louder, but by cutting sharper. You say I lack real-world experience? Let me remind you what the real world looks like. The real world is families evicted because landlords hiked rents overnight. The real world is kids who show up to school hungry because their parents work 3 jobs that still don't pay enough. The real world is people sitting in jail cells, not because they're guilty, but because they couldn't afford bail. Hey, that's the world I came from, the world I've fought in, and the world I represent. That's what I bring into Congress every single day. Psst, whispers. A camera zoomed in on Clooney, catching the moment his eyes darted downward, away from hers. He had mastered the art of pretending control on screen. But here, against her steady stare, the facade cracked. Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned, in slightly, her tone unshaken. And let's talk receipts, since you seem to think substance is optional. While you were filming red carpet interviews in Venice, I was cross-examining corrupt officials who stole from taxpayers. While you were headlining fundraisers with champagne flutes, I was drafting legislation to make sure working parents had childcare. While you were performing speeches for applause, I was on the ground, standing with families whose homes were flooded because leaders ignored infrastructure needs in black and brown communities. Another murmur, sharper now. Clooney's smirk faltered completely, replaced by a jaw set tight. His body shifted, shoulders drawing inward, a hand brushing nervously at his tie. He tried to hold her gaze, but his eyes betrayed him, flicking toward the crowd, toward the cameras. Searching for support that wasn't there anymore, Crockett pressed forward. Her words now rhythmic, each sentence layered over the last like stone on stone. You call me a lightweight? Let's weigh what? I've carried clients who couldn't afford lawyers. I've carried communities dismissed as statistics. I've carried the expectations of every young black girl told her dreams were too heavy for her shoulders. And still, I'm here. Still. Standing, still speaking, still unshaken. The audience erupted into scattered applause before being hushed again by the gravity of the moment. Clooney's name, his glamour, his celebrity Shanette, all seemed to shrink under the weight of her lived truth. She let the silence breathe for a moment. It's a kind of silence that made even the hum of the cameras sound deafening. Then she delivered. The line that would be replayed endlessly in clips across social media. The line that would haunt Clooney's arrogance. See, George, she said, her voice low but unbreakable. You've made a career pretending to be the hero, but I don't need to play a hero on screen. I live it every day. And that's why your words don't land here. Because when arrogance meets truth, arrogance always loses. The room exploded gasps, whispers, some outright cheers muffled quickly by the formality of the setting. The sound of phones capturing video buzzed beneath the din, so the world outside the walls was already pulling this moment into its bloodstream. Clooney sat frozen, his face flushed, his trademark smile gone. He tried to clear his throat, to lean into the microphone as if to respond, but the words never came. Crockett had landed the blow with surgical precision. Not by raising her voice, not by trading insult for insult, but by stacking undeniable truths until Clooney's bravado collapsed under their weight. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a dismantling. The cameras captured every detail. Clooney's jaw tightening, his eyes flicking downward, his hand nervously tapping the table. They captured the way Crockett didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even look victorious. She simply sat back, composed, as if to say, "This is what preparation looks like. This is what dignity sounds like." The silence that followed was the most deafening sound of all.
Ow.
No applause, no laughter, no clever comeback from Clooney. Just silence. And outside that silence, the storm was already brewing. Clips were uploading. Hashtags were forming. Millions were about to witness the unraveling of a Hollywood giant at the hands of a congresswoman who refused to be diminished. The silence after her words was deafening, but outside that room, the explosion was just beginning. Silence. In that room did not last long. By the time the cameras cut away, the internet had already ignited. Within minutes, the first clips of Jasmine Crockett's takedown hit Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Hashtags sprang up like wildfire. Hashtag Crockett claps back. Hashtag receipts, vs red carpet, and the one that dominated the night, hashtag truth over fame. Each clip was shorter, sharper, edited for maximum punch. But the core remained the same, Clooney's smug dismissal evaporating under the weight of Crockett's calm. Devastating counterattack. Memes exploded across feeds. One showed Clooney, with a script in hand captioned, "When you forget this isn't a movie set." Another looped Crockett's mic drop line, "I don't need to play a hero on screen. I live it."
Ow.
Juxtaposed with shots of Clooney's stunned silence. TikTok creators reenacted the scene in skits, lip-syncing Crockett's words while pausing to sip tea at the exact moment she leaned forward. The moment had become more than a clapback. It was culture-shifting content, and it spread with the speed of outrage and vindication colliding. Journalists rushed to frame it. Headlines poured in within hours. Crockett silences Clooney with facts, not fame.
Hollywood
Meets its match in Congresswoman Crockett. Receipts overread. Carpets, Crockett's viral moment redefines power. Op-eds dissected the deeper meaning why a beloved actor's words had landed so poorly, and why Crockett's composure resonated with such force. For some, it was a story about celebrity overreach. For others, it was about gender, race, and the resilience of women in politics who refused to be silenced. Even Clooney's peers weighed in. Some offered half-hearted defenses, suggesting he had been misunderstood. Others, sensing the cultural tide, distanced themselves quickly, praising Crockett for her poise and calling her response a lesson in leadership. A few brave voices in Hollywood admitted openly what many whispered, that fame had long given celebrities unearned authority in conversations they barely understood. Crockett, they said, had exposed that imbalance in one unforgettable moment. But the shockwaves traveled beyond headlines and hashtags. On college campuses, professors slipped the clip into lectures on media power and representation. Students debated it in classrooms and dorm lounges, parsing the layers of arrogance, entitlement, and resistance. Community leaders shared it at local meetings, holding Crockett up as proof that dignity could outlast spectacle. In churches, barbershops, and kitchen tables, the conversation circled back to the same truth. Representation mattered, and Crockett had carried that truth with grace. Talk shows replayed the footage, panelists arguing whether Clooney's brand could ever recover. Morning anchors framed it as the latest flashpoint in America's ongoing struggle with who gets to speak and who gets silenced. Political commentators declared it a watershed moment. A clash not just between two figures, but between two forces. The power of celebrity and the power of lived experience. And then came the ripple effect on young audiences. High school students quoted Crockett in their speeches, some posting their own versions online. Aspiring lawyers and activists stitched themselves alongside the viral clip, saying, "This is why I study. This is why I fight." For many, Crockett's moment wasn't just entertainment. It was permission. It's permission to be sharp, to be unapologetic, to take up space without shrinking for anyone's comfort. Clooney, meanwhile, went quiet. His PR team scrambled, but no statement could erase the visual of him squirming under Crockett's steady gaze. The internet had already made up its mind. His silence became another meme. Screenshots of him speechless, captioned plot twist, the script had no ending. For once, Hollywood's golden boy wasn't controlling the narrative. The narrative had turned on him. But Crockett's victory wasn't measured in Clooney's stumble. It was measured in the cultural spark she lit. This was bigger than a single. Exchange bigger than one celebrity's arrogance. It was proof that truth, when delivered with clarity and courage, could cut through even the noisiest distractions. In an age drowning in sound bites, Crockett's words stood as a reminder that substance still mattered, and as the hashtags trended, as the memes multiplied, as the debates spilled from newsrooms to dinner tables, one thing became clear. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won a moment, she had shifted the conversation. She had turned a Hollywood insult into a national reckoning. But Crockett didn't stop there. She transformed this attack into a universal lesson. When the storm of laughter, memes, and headlines settled, Jasmine Crockett did not let the moment remain just a personal victory. She stepped into the spotlight once more, not to gloat, not to drag Clooney's name further, but to reframe what had happened. She reminded everyone watching that the insult thrown at her was never just about her. It was about the countless women, especially women of color, who were dismissed, underestimated, or talked over in every room where decisions are made. Crockett spoke with the same measured tone she had carried throughout the confrontation. "This isn't about me," she said. "This is about who gets to be heard in America. This is about whether your worth is tied to your fame or to your fight." In that one statement, she pivoted the narrative away from a Hollywood star and back toward the people she served. She reframed the insult as living proof of why representation matters, not just in Congress, but everywhere voices have been silenced. Her words carried a universal truth. Dignity outlasts arrogance. Clooney had come armed with star power, with the arrogance of a man used to commanding rooms with nothing more than a smile. But Crockett showed that dignity, anchored in service and lived experience, could withstand anything. Dignity doesn't glitter, it doesn't chase applause, but it endures. And in the face of arrogance, it shines brighter than any spotlight. She pressed further. Service is greater than celebrity. Clooney had played heroes on screen. Crockett lived the role every day, serving constituents who weren't impressed by red carpets but who trusted her to fight for their rights. Service, Crockett reminded her audience, wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It meant showing up, listening, sacrificing. It meant being accountable not to applause but to people. In her calm rebuke, she drew a line between playing a role and carrying responsibility. And that line cut deeper than any insult ever could. And then came the crescendo, the universal truth that electrified her supporters. Truth has more power than ego. Clooney's ego had filled the room, but Crockett's truth had emptied it, leaving him speechless. In that moment, the cameras didn't just capture a debate, they captured a parable. Ego may swagger, but truth stands. Ego may dominate headlines, but truth changes history. For those watching, the emotional payoff was undeniable. Crockett turned what was meant to belittle her into fuel for justice. Every slight, every attempt to silence her, became proof of why her presence mattered. Her resilience wasn't just personal, it was political, cultural, and deeply symbolic. By refusing to shrink, she had expanded the space for others to stand taller, and so the narrative crystallized. Clooney had entered the room as the celebrity, the star whose words were expected to carry weight. But when the dust settled, it was Crockett who became the symbol. A symbol of calm in the face of arrogance. A symbol of dignity when met with disrespect. A symbol that truth, spoken clearly and unapologetically, can silence even the loudest ego. The crescendo of her message reverberated beyond the confrontation. It was no longer just about one exchange between a Hollywood actor and a congresswoman. It became about every young woman who had been told her voice was too sharp. Every immigrant who had been told their story didn't matter. Every ordinary person who felt unseen. Crockett's poise was their vindication. Her words were their echo. Her victory was their reminder that arrogance will always fade, but truth will rise. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett became more than a congresswoman, she became a symbol. George, Clooney may have walked into that room armed with fame, charm, and the arrogance of a man used to being untouchable, but he walked out silent. The insult he hurled was meant to diminish Jasmine Crockett, to make her small. Instead, it only magnified her strength. What he thought would be a cutting dismissal became the stage for her to deliver the mic drop of the year. Clooney was left speechless, and Crockett walked away larger than life. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a revelation of power. Crockett's poise turned arrogance into ash. Her calm transformed an insult into a universal truth. And in doing so, she reminded us that the greatest strength isn't found in the spotlight of Hollywood. It's found in the lived resilience of those who serve, sacrifice, and refuse to be silenced. She showed us what it means to rise above ego with dignity and tact, to meet hostility with unshakable truth. That's why this moment matters. It isn't just about Clooney or Crockett. It's about every one of us who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or spoken over. Crockett stood her ground and, in doing so, she stood for us. If you believe dignity is stronger than arrogance, share this story. If you believe truth can silence ego, subscribe for more moments where truth takes the mic back. Join this movement of voices that will not be quieted, because history is watching. So are we.